All right, good afternoon, class. This is John checking back in. Going to pick up with our larger theme of imperialism that we've been discussing throughout much of the week, and how Europe and the Industrial Revolution continue to drive change throughout the late 1800s with things like the scramble for Africa. We didn't talk about it too much in class, but the arrival of European countries and interests in China is going to be a phenomenon. China will respond to that as well, although not very effectively. But today we're looking and focusing our attention most squarely on the United States and its role within this larger theme. And of course, the United States isn't quite as active. It doesn't take on the same size or number of imperial possessions, but nonetheless it plays a role here, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today. In class I went through talking a little bit about some of the domestic or internal considerations or issues that the United States was wrestling with that had a role in driving the United States out onto the international stage, and I'll leave these for you to digest as you see fit if you need to spend more time with them. And then I did talk a little bit about American empire and the Monroe Doctrine of the 1820s and how that starts to become more of a consideration and more of a guiding doctrine by the late 1800s. The United States shares a similar approach to its European counterparts in the way in which it interacts with its imperial possessions. It has this aura of superiority, and it uses terms and justifications like civilizing these groups of people that otherwise could benefit from greater exposure to European society and civilization. This is all interesting. I think the other thing that I want to add there, just repeat, is that the United States, much like its European counterparts, in extending its boundaries and its possessions to other continents like Africa, Asia, in the case of the United States, Central America, and the Pacific, it does not extend the privileges and rights that go with being an American citizen. So all those wonderful classical liberalism, civil or political values are not being extended to these new possessions. Okay, so let's talk about Cuba. Pardon me. And here we start with a very important figure. His name is Jose Marti. And before the United States was actively involved in Cuba, Jose Marti, who is a poet, an intellectual in 19th century Cuban history, had been calling attention to Cuba's need to break free once and for all from its colonial status underneath the Spanish government. And so he's going to be a real active mover and shaker, calling attention and mobilizing, galvanizing Cubans of the late 19th century to take action against what he perceives to be the injustices of Spanish colonial rule. And I put this image up here. This is sort of a political cartoon of the time, but it shows some of that cultural superiority. These kinds of cartoons appeared with greater frequency in the major American newspapers of the late 1800s. And you can see here the imagery of the United States as a mature, sensible, capable mother looking after the otherwise immature and infantile Cuba. And this, of course, is in the context of trying to protect Cuba from Spain. This is actually one of the more tame cartoons of that time. Oops, and then maybe it won't let me do that. It won't let me do that. Sorry. I have a picture underneath that cartoon of the flag being hoisted over Havana in Cuba at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War in 1898. And let me just mention, I will start using the term Spanish Cuban-American War, because even the term Spanish-American War has a tremendous amount of sort of cultural superiority tied up in it. It's worth noting that the Spanish-Cuban-American War began as a bid by Cubans for Cuban independence, and it wasn't until the United States intervened midway through the conflict, actually past midway through the conflict, that this changed. So a couple things I want to point out here in rather quick succession. Cuba was a Spanish colony for almost 400 years, and it had managed not to gain its independence in the early 1800s when many Spanish colonies on the mainland of the Americas were gaining independence. And part of this has to do with the relatively small white or European planter class that was in charge of Cuba, and there were fears that independence could turn sort of like the experience of Haiti. Things could turn out that way on account of the incredible imbalance in terms of slave versus free European inhabitants of the island. This should actually say 1868 to 1878, and there was an earlier effort by the Cubans to assert and gain their independence from Spain called the 10 Years' War. This war was essentially fought to a draw, and while it did have some benefits in terms of getting rid of slavery and also softening the power of the planter class on the island of Cuba, it did not throw off Spanish control, and so in some ways it was just fought to a truce. But in the time from the 10 Years' War, from 1878 to 1898, which is when the United States will enter into the Spanish-Cuban-American War, pardon me, the United States had increased its economic ties with Cuba. In fact, during this 3-decade period, a number of U.S. sugar interests had entered in and purchased sugar growing lands and storage facilities. The ties of U.S. sugar refining to the Cuban island all were increased as well. So in that 3-decade period, it's important to note that the United States and Cuba were becoming closer in ways that were economically beneficial, but also sort of politically questionable. Not necessarily how the Cuban revolutionaries or the people in favor of Cuban independence would have wanted it. Starting in 1895, the Cubans, again, following up on the 10 Years' War example, become once again fed up and try to throw off the chains of Spanish colonial rule once and for all. And this was fought for 3.5 years before the United States will intervene, and there were tremendous consequences. About 20% of the Cuban population was killed as a result of this early phase in the Spanish-Cuban, then later American War. Other consequences were the economy. About 2/3 of Cuba's productive capacity was destroyed as a result of the first few years of this war. So Cuba was definitely in a difficult situation, and it was also vulnerable. And it's into this place that the United States will enter in, and the official story of American involvement comes with the sinking of the Maine and Havana Harbor, which was probably based on a inaccurate newspaper report. We don't believe that the Spanish Navy actually did bomb the Maine. It could have been just an internal boiler that blew up on the U.S. naval ship, the Maine. And anyway, that becomes the pretext under which the United States enters into the Spanish-Cuban-American War. And that is a very decisive entry. The war will soon after be completed. The United States and Cuba, if you want to think of it that way, will be the victors. But then this creates a very delicate and difficult scenario whereby the United States has come upon the scene, has sort of come to the rescue, so to speak, and as a result, Cuba's independence which has finally been achieved, is now going to bear a very strong American imprint upon that independence. And one good example of that comes in the Platt Amendment, and this was passed in 1901. Essentially, the Platt Amendment, this is odd, is an amendment written into the new Cuban Constitution, but it's written in there by American politicians. Platt was a senator from Connecticut, and he had it put into the Cuban Amendment certain restrictions upon Cuba's freedom because it needed to make sure the United States had control, power, and influence over this newly independent country. And this is something that has been very much resented by Cubans ever since. So Cuba, for example, could not just make treaties with any other country unless it first had the permission of the United States. So there were limits there. There were limits as to how it could make agreements with other countries. For example, Cuba could not go into debt. That would perhaps make Cuba dependent on another country in a way that would harm the United States' interests in this nearby neighbor. It also indicated the United States reserved the right to enter into Cuban affairs to help Cuba remain independent. And look at all those interventions. They happened very regularly throughout the early 20th century. And then in the 1930s, the Cubans will rise up against this very, I guess you could say, insulting or condescending arrangement that the United States has put into the Cuban Constitution. And so it's really important when you think today about Fidel Castro, who is he is probably in the final weeks of his life, for all we know. He's very old, but has been the face of the Cuban government ever since its revolution in 1959. But much of the animosity and anger among Cubans with the United States is traceable to this time period. And some of you will know that the Guantanamo naval base in Cuba is an American naval base. But what's odd is the United States doesn't even have a functioning relationship with Cuba. But because of the Platt Amendment, we still reserve and insist upon this base as being an American possession. So the Guantanamo Bay naval base is a tremendous symbol and meaningful source of frustration for Cubans to this day. And most of the terms of the Platt Amendment were removed in the 1930s by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, important U.S. president, but nonetheless, a lot of these frustrations and concerns linger. So thank you, good luck getting ready for your exam, and we'll see you tomorrow.